I hear journalism students say, I am not good at math. The implication I hear when students say that is that I want to pursue journalism because I like writing. I like talking to people. I like issues in society, but I am not interested in math. I don't want a course in economics. That is for business students. That's the gist of what I hear from some students. But everything costs something, and costs affect everyone's life. And like I said earlier, two of the largest and most important topics in journalism are politics and economics. I've advised taking courses in political science and economics as electives to fill out your degree in journalism. There are the political science faculty here at this university is wonderful. Their courses are worth taking. We have a good economics department. And I've also advised the communication department that we should be creating our own journalism courses in politics and economics. But we haven't got there yet. And you could always lobby for that sort of thing. It helps. You can't avoid politics and economics in journalism. They just infuse the primary news values in journalism of impact and magnitude. Whatever story you are doing, believe me, it will probably have a political angle or an economic angle or both. Economics has a direct and powerful effect on the life of individuals and communities. So look for that. Politics deals with the power and management of what affects individuals and communities, including their economic well-being. And there are even power dynamics in most situations outside what we consider to be politics. So look for the power dynamics, make it part of your story. Think, for example, right now of the effect of the massive stimulus spending being done for governments now because of the coronavirus. The COVID has had serious economic impact. The economic impact can put pressure on society that can increase civil unrest and crime. The government stimulus spending is intended to alleviate the economic problems of individuals and keep the engine of the economy running. Since the economy of democracies mainly depends on consumer spending, the economy falters if people don't have money, and because they don't have money, they reduce spending. So stimulus spending alleviates current economic problems temporarily, but the cost of stimulus spending is massive debt that has to be paid in the future. Paying off the debt in the future could increase taxes, and when people pay more taxes, consumer spending declines. So far, maybe that seems like a remote issue to you personally. Your life, you feel, is now, what you are experiencing now. But how will stimulus spending affect you personally in the future? You get a job, and now your taxes increase because of spending done years ago. The stimulus money is gone. The taxes are there to pay now. Maybe others will feel the same way. Maybe politics in a few years will be affected by the need to pay off this massive debt and increase taxes. So there's almost always an economic angle, which is exactly what the text says, the relevant chapters for today. There's always an economic angle if you can see it. Even if you are not specifically on the business beat, the text says, there's likely a business angle to your story. For instance, consider the beginning of chapter 9 in the text, the chapter called The Broad Beat of Business. The text also has a separate chapter, chapter 7, on local government finances. That is 2 chapters alone devoted to economics and spending. And as you go through other individual chapters, you'll see advice on the economic angle of the story. Chapter 9 in the text begins with the coverage of the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq by a Dallas newspaper in the U.S. state of Texas. A war story is obviously a military story, but the text makes the point that there's a strong economic story as well with multiple angles. The night the war started, the Dallas Morning News was working on business stories related to the war. And the text gives some of the angles of those business stories related to war. Those angles were the war's possible impact on the national economy and on the local economy. The economic effect of a quick, decisive victory compared to a long, drawn-out Vietnam War scenario. The positive or negative effects on specific national and local industries, such as the Texas-based airline. The effect on oil prices, which is important in the state of Texas because it has oil industries such as Texas-based companies like ExxonMobil. And the effect on consumers of the price of gas because of the war. The effect on media advertising, which of course affects journalism. The effect on tourism and hotel reservations. So you see the text breaks it down into a series of angles in that case study of the Dallas Morning News at the outset of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. As well, the text says natural disasters have an economic effect, meaning that when you're writing a natural disaster story, you should also be covering the economic effect of the natural disaster. Journalism publications, some journalism publications are just devoted to business and economics, employing journalists to do that. And often there's a full section on business. The text says that the business beat can be broken down into separate specific business beats, depending on the size of the news outlet. So in its example of the Dallas Morning News, that newspaper has 50 reporters and editors alone, 50 on the business desk, just devoted to business stories. And the text lists 14 different specialized economy beats that one would expect to see. Among those 14 are labor and employment as a business beat, real estate and housing as a business beat, transportation as a business beat, sports as a business beat, and personal finance. Those are just some of the 14 sub-beats the text says you could find in the business beat. The final assignment in this course gives you some options to write economic stories. As for example, one option is the question, how is the Kamloops tourism economy projected to fare in 2021, this year, with the problems of the effect of the COVID pandemic on tourism? A number in the class have chosen that option. Or another option one was, how is the whole economy of Kamloops projected to fare in 2021? Or another option was, how should the tuition, that's a money issue, how should the tuition of Indigenous students at TRU be affected by the fact that the Indigenous land was never ceded? There were other options of assignments that could have economic components. So one option was about immigrants, and that could involve the angle, how are immigrants to Canada affected by the economic effect of the COVID pandemic. Another option was about the future for employment of journalists in Canada. Some of you have taken that option. So that could have an economic angle. How is the future of employment for journalists in Canada affected by economic factors? Thus, half of the options for the final assignment could have an economics angle. And that means data, and that means experts. And that's something, those are two factors which help to make a news story feasible. The data and the experts. Is there data? How accessible is the data? Are there experts? How accessible are the experts? One of the great things about economics is that it is rooted in the empirical reality of quantities. In this case, money as a definite quantity. Quantities are data. The data also allows for the measurement of human behavior, how people spend or don't spend. One of the few areas outside of election data where we have precise evidence, quantifiable evidence of an action. We can measure how much people spend or how much they don't spend, and we can measure the number of votes. And so we can calculate both. That also allows us to calculate what people don't spend and allows us to measure missing votes. So with the measurable data in economics, that makes human behavior quantifiable. And that's always a problem. How are you going to quantify mass human behavior? And how, based on that, how are you going to predict human behavior? There's a whole discipline that combines economics with human behavior, which is called behavioral economics. Behavioral economics shows that people behave irrationally, not rationally. And behavioral economics helps to predict irrational behavior in the future. So the research on human behavior and behavioral economics can give clues about how people will behave politically. Voting can be emotional and irrational, not rational. It defies rationality, for an example, that Americans would vote in 2016 for Donald Trump, a businessman preoccupied with himself and preoccupied with benefits himself, who ignores what is best for his country. In 2016, Trump was not the rational choice. And so many of the predictions based on the premise of rationality were that Trump would not be elected. But rationality is not always a good guide to what irrational human beings will do. Trump had impulses, not policies. He relied on hunches, not real data. He was briefed on January 28 last year what a serious threat the COVID was to his country, but he ignored that briefing and ignored speaking publicly on what he knew because it didn't fit his personal psychology for his own survival. Trump appealed to the irrationality and emotions of enough voters to get himself elected in 2016. The professional media and the Democrats were blindsided on this because their predictions and confidence was based on rationality and good sense. So, irrational or not, economics influences people, and people influence economics. Think of the stock market or think of a run on a bank. The stock market goes up or down, partly based on what people hope or people fear, based on emotion. The stock market is affected by optimism and pessimism that may not be related, may not be connected with reality. Or consider another type of example, the run on a bank that causes the collapse of a bank. And it works this way. A bank takes the money of its depositors and uses most of that money to make more money. That is, it lends out and invests the deposited money of its depositors. That means that at any time, the bank does not have all the money of the depositors, only a fraction of the money of depositors. When an individual donor comes to the bank for his or her money, the depositor can be paid. But if a group of depositors is afraid it can't get its money, the group rushes to the bank, and the bank does not have all the money there at that time to pay those depositors. That causes the spread of a report or even a rumor that the bank does not have the money, and there's a panic. It's a self-enforcing loop, and more people panic, and more people discover that their money is not in the bank, and so the panic run on the bank results, and the bank collapses, even though technically the bank could recall the loans it's made out of depositors' money. It just can't recall it fast enough in the case of a bank run. And so the bank collapses. And so it's the fear and panic of the group that causes what the group fears, the collapse of the bank. That is not rational. In the same way, companies and commodities can increase in value on paper because they become popular, because people think and hope their value will increase, so they buy shares in companies and commodities because they anticipate the value increasing. And the result is that some companies and commodities become overvalued. That is, they're worth more on paper than they're worth in reality. That creates a financial bubble. The more popular the company or the commodity becomes, the more people buy and invest in them, and the more that people buy and invest in them, the more their worth on paper increases, at least until the bubble or the overvaluation gets so large and so out of proportion that it's ripe to burst, and there's something that causes it to burst, at which time the value on paper declines. And when the value on paper starts to decline, there is a panic, a self-reinforcing cycle of panic that hastens the decline. So that is not rational. Like I said, economics influences people, and people influence economics. Political theorists typically say that the state of the economy in a country has a huge effect on elections. One of the people who says that is the economist Paul Krugman, a winner of the Nobel Prize in economics. And I put two of Krugman's books on the recommended reading list in this course. And if you're interested, they're fascinating books by an expert. And if you read those books, you'll see the connection between economics, politics, and human action. So one of the political theorists that says, makes that common statement that the state of economy in a country has a huge effect on elections is Paul Krugman. The theory is that when an economy of a country is doing well, voters don't want to change the government. They don't want to elect a different party to govern the country. The people in general, according to research in economics and behavioral economics and psychology, is that people in general are risk averse and don't want a change, no matter how much they might dislike certain politicians. They're risk averse when they have something to lose and the economy is doing well. If the economy is doing poorly, there's nothing to lose in risking a change. And the theory is that, and what we see happening is that opposition politicians will appeal to the hopes and fears that the current government doesn't know what it is doing economically, and the opposition politicians can fix the economic problems. And so then, according to this theory, a government is like gets pinned down by economic factors over which it may not be responsible. So some politicians, the opposition politicians, according to the theory, can prey on the emotion and fear of electors during a poor economy to motivate them to take the risk in changing governments. So the theory is that voters will stick with the current government if the economy is good, and voters will elect the opposition politician if the economy is bad. That's the theory anyway. And we know from watching politics that the opposition politicians who blame the previous government on the economic state, once they get into power, they say if they can't fix the problem, they blame it not on their own ability to fix the problem, but on what they inherited from the previous government. So in 2008, when the Democrat politician Barack Obama was running to be elected president of the United States, that was in the midst of the economic crisis that started in 2007, and that economic crisis was getting worse, even worse in 2008 at election time. And so according to the theory, that would be a time when voters would be ready to switch political parties to the Democrats. In that election, in 2008 election, Americans elected the first Black president of the United States, and the Democrats in Congress had a huge upswing in members elected to vanquish what had been a Republican majority. Whether or not that is an example of the economic theory about elections, that's what happened. Obama, a Democrat, got elected. The Democrats did well. Besides the advantage of economics having quantifiable data available, there is the scheduled and cyclical nature of economics, which the text talks about. That is, the release of a lot of business data is scheduled. So as a journalist, you know when it's coming. You have a calendar where you list in advance all the dates on which different economic information will be released. And And so, and as well, there's the annual budget cycle of different government data. And so you know what the annual budget cycle of any specific government is, and you're prepared for the staged events in that process. There's also schedules for the release of specific economic data like home sales, quarterly business reports, gross national product, inflation rate, bank interest rates, and so on. So economics has a huge impact on people and countries, and economics produces empirical data as evidence of what is happening. Economics means that you can write stories on what has a huge impact on people using data. Food costs money. Living accommodations cost money. Getting a university education costs money. Raising a family costs money. Being able to retire costs money. Having a holiday costs money. Even being a citizen costs money. Even getting free information on the internet depends on the cost of a device to access the internet and on the cost of Wi-Fi. So when we think all the time, oh, isn't the internet great because I can get that information for free? Well, actually, you don't get it for free because you have to buy an expensive device like a computer, a tablet, or smartphone to get that free information on the internet. So if there was no internet and social media, people wouldn't buy smartphones. They'd buy a cheaper flip phone like the one I have. Taxes are going up. Incomes are going up or down. People's life assets, such as home equity and pensions, go up or down. And people want to know what's happening. They want you to do the math for them because they don't like doing math. They will pay you to write the story about economics and to do the math for them. And the math requirements for you are fairly simple. And when the math requirements get complex, don't worry. You interview the economic experts, and that's how you do the math. And people pay you because they don't want to do the math. The data you need for economic stories is usually available from a government source or corporate source or an independent expert. And that's a huge advantage to you in the economic angle of a story in journalism. A country like Canada collects economic data and posts it online. A country like Canada has national business associations, including a business association for Canadian newspapers. In 2016, the News Media Canada Association was formed by amalgamating the National Business Association for Daily Newspapers, the CNA, with the National Business Association for Community Newspapers, the CCNA. Most cities have a business association that collects business data. A large city may have different business associations for different types of businesses, and those associations likely collect data. Universities like this one have a business faculty who the media can interview as independent experts. So you don't have to worry that much about access to that. You just have, the data is there, the experts are there. You just have to find the relevant data and find the relevant source who knows where the data is. The typical story in journalism is usually reliable data or facts interpreted by a reliable expert source with a human element that engages the human audience. So always look for an economic angle to a story, even if you don't automatically think of that. Ask yourself, what's the economic angle to this story? For example, we've seen locally in Kamloops, and I saw when I was a reporter in Ontario, that the local Humane Society at certain times would find an increase in abandoned pets. And the question would be, besides just recording the increase in abandoned pets, is what is causing the increase? What is causing the change in human behavior? And one answer that typically came up in those situations was that people were abandoning pets because they couldn't afford them. And what you would do then to test that theory is you would look at what's happening economically and what's happening in this behavior of abandoning pets. That is, in bad economic times, do people abandon more pets? When the economy gets good, does the abandonment of pets go down? Right when I say that right now, I would predict a story angle involving pets, a different story angle related to this. So what I'm hearing is stories that because of the COVID lockdown, people are buying more pets. They're getting lonely being by themselves. They want companionship. So sales of pets are apparently increasing. But what will happen when we get widespread vaccination and people can go back to work? What happens to the pets? What do people do about their pets who now are left alone all day? And that means the dogs are going to bark and things like that. Actually, I was thinking about that partly because I went out for a walk this morning. I had my headphone on and I was listening to local CBC is working on a story of a story angle that employers may have to consider provisions to allow employees to bring their pets to work. This university passed a no pet policy because certain faculties seemed prone to bringing their dogs to work, one or two, and created a policy that faculty couldn't bring pets unless they were service dogs. Anyway, the CBC, sounds like the CBC is working on that story for today or tomorrow, but I didn't hear an angle, the Humane Society angle. That is, could there, as people go back to work, will there be an increase in abandoning pets? So that idea occurs to me as a journalist. I would then, put it in my notebook and say, okay, watch for this phenomena, or maybe do a story asking, is this going to happen? Now, still with the Humane Society. So let's say it's a fair interpretation that when the economy is bad, there are more abandoned pets. We could get data in the past and see if there's a correlation there. There's another economic angle dealing with the Humane Society. If the number of pets in the local Humane Society increase, how does that affect the budget of the organization? And that's exactly what happened several years ago in Kamloops during an economic downturn. There's an increase in pets. The Humane Society was trying to deal with that. Now the Humane Society has its own economic problem of of resources and budget for that increase. Or consider an economic angle to an election campaign, the campaign spending. How will the chances for election be affected by donations, for the amount of money that a politician is able to communicate to pay for the campaign? If big donations come from individuals or corporations, how can that influence the politicians once elected? Will the politician pay back the big campaign donors by government actions that favor them? And for example, if you look at Donald Trump, in the case of Donald Trump, the wealthy business family, conservative business family of the Mercers spent millions of dollars paying Cambridge Analytica to help the Trump election campaign. And as conservative thinkers and as conservative business people, they saw an advantage in spending money to get Trump elected in 2016. Another angle, how are jobs affected by the economy? Or how are jobs in journalism affected by the economy? If the economy isn't doing well, retail business may decline. If retail business declines, then retail businesses spend less on advertising and the media gets less revenue from advertising. If there's less revenue from advertising, there's less money to pay for journalists. So, you ask, you continually ask yourself, is there an economic angle to a story that has impact on your audience or intrigue your audience? And I think back to my time as a newspaper journalist. I once did an economic story about the secret finances of a power company that was given a monopoly and also regulated by the government. And the story idea occurred to me because when I attended a municipal council, the municipal councilors were always grumbling about this power monopoly at municipal council. And all they could do was grumble. It had a monopoly. There was nothing to do. And you understand the situation in Ontario. Most of the electricity in Ontario is managed by the government crown corporation called Ontario Hydro. But there was a small and odd packet of consumers in the area where I was getting their electricity not from Ontario Hydro, but from an old private company that had existed before Ontario Hydro and continued to exist. And so there was a small and old pocket of consumers getting their electricity from this old power company. The company generated electricity from the government that allowed it to use rivers, which can't be owned privately. A corporation can't own a river or a lake. It's only owned by the public as a company. But the government of Ontario had allowed this company to use the public river to generate electricity. Because the company was private, its profit margin was public. So you couldn't tell how much profit this private electrical company was making, even though it was regulated by the government. The government that regulated the power company didn't know its profit margin. And the profit margin is how you reach an opinion, is this monopoly fair or unfair? Is the profit margin of a monopoly fair or unfair? Well, you couldn't know that. And the government, which regulated the private power company, couldn't know that because it didn't have access to the private finances of the company. Anyway, that sounded like a story for me. You know, the municipal council was grumbling, but they had no idea on how they could determine whether or not consumers were being treated fairly by this monopoly regulated by the government. So I thought, that's a great story. That's, you know, a story that would show that people were being gouged by an unfair profit margin. That's a story that local consumers would want to need, but that other people would also sympathize with. But I didn't have access to the company's finances. Freedom of information request would not work. And later in this course, I'm going to talk about freedom of information legislation that allows you to make an application for information. Freedom of information legislation, which is there's provincial freedom of information legislation and national freedom of information legislation. But that freedom of information laws only apply to government agencies, not to private businesses. So you can't file an FOI request that under that law to get information about private business. So I knew I couldn't do that. But the key to the story would be to be able to calculate reasonably how much profit the company was making when it is private, is a monopoly, and doesn't have to disclose its profit. Luckily, I didn't need a degree in economics to do that. I didn't need to be a math whiz to do that. I just needed to collect data and find the experts. So I talked to the experts and collected, actually, I think they actually collected the data for me. It was enough for them. I found two separate independent experts. They were intrigued by the challenge of this topic. That is, intrigued by the challenge of calculating how much profit the company was making in a monopoly. And since I was a journalist, the reward for doing the work would be that I would publish the story. I would quote them. They would feel satisfied in having done a public service, and it would add to their credibility. So I asked two experts to calculate how much it would cost to generate electricity, having the data, which they did, of the annual flow of rivers and how much you could typically generate electricity from the flow of rivers, and what would typical costs be, and so what you subtract the cost from the revenue, and you get the profit. Anyway, a part of my point in that story is I'm no math whiz, I'm no economic expert. Thank goodness I could work as a journalist, and I could therefore appeal to the experts. One big economic issue is the degree of economic equality in society. That is, what is the economic range and economic concentration of wealth in a society? So what we and the data is there. So what we typically find in Western countries, in democracies, is not a democratic economic system, not a democratic economic system. We find economic inequalities, even though theoretically voters can elect a government that reduces economic inequality. The mystery is that voters in democracies elect governments that increase economic inequality and disadvantage them. So what we typically find in democracies is that a few people have the most wealth and a large group have the least wealth. And that kind of economic inequality causes pressure in society and can lead to civil unrest and crime. You know, you look at areas, you look and see if there's a correlation between an area where there's high unemployment and low salary, and what kind of crime rate is there in that area, and how does it compare to other areas where there's high employment and high salaries. So there's the theory that there is more pressure on areas with low employment and low wages. And in any community, you should be able to get this kind of economic statistic, which you could use for stories. So according to the economist Paul Krugman, the U.S., using data, the U.S. has gone from high economic inequality to relative equality, and now back to high economic inequality. During the return of economic inequality, voters elected in the United States a billionaire named Donald Trump, who had been avoiding paying his fair share of taxes, as we now know from the reporting by the New York Times, and we're now aware that public prosecutors in the United States are examining that issue of whether Trump avoided paying his fair share of taxes. So Krugman says that the U.S. went at the same time that it went through this period of relative equality back to high economic equality. Krugman sees a political correlation in that the U.S. went politically from extreme partisanship to bipartisan politics, with the two U.S. political parties, Democrats and Republicans, cooperating, now back to extreme partisanship, where there is a correlation, says Krugman, a correlation between high economic inequality and extreme partisanship. And Krugman and others believe that these things happen together, but maybe that's taking the theory too far. But nevertheless, both phenomena, polarization in politics and economic inequality, both are worth reporting on. The point is that economic theory can give you a context for reporting. It can help identify what pressures to look for in society and what questions to ask. Where is the economic inequality in society? Where are the pressures on a society of economic inequality? And we could start to look at that in Canada. We could start to ask geographically, or in terms of ethnic groups, where is the economic inequality in Canada? What are the parts of Canada where there's pressure on society because of the economic inequality? We could even go at a micro level in Kamloops, and we could ask, can we find economic inequality in Kamloops? That is, are there parts of Kamloops where there's higher unemployment and lower wages, and are there parts of Kamloops where there are low employment and higher wages? And of course, one way we might use place we might look for empirical data on that are housing sales. What parts of Kamloops have higher average house prices? What parts of Kamloops have low average of housing prices? And we could see if there's a correlation between those economic factors and unemployment and wages and crime and other social pressures. You might do that work and maybe maybe it doesn't yield the results you want, or maybe it does yield the results you want. But the point is, it gives you an idea for how to start. It gives you an idea to how to start and where to look in an economic theory. So we have that context. It's a myth that we have a free market economy in democracies where the market alone makes decisions. Actually, even in democracies, the economic system is regulated by governments. And some governments regulate the economic system less, and some regulate it more. Some want increased regulation, some want deregulation. And the politicians who want deregulation, they sell that economic theory to the voters. And in fact, both liberal and conservative politicians sell economic theory to the voters. They both say, our economic theory is such and such, and that will benefit you and society. So elect our party because we know how to handle the economy. And they have both parties, or in Canada, we have more than one party. So you have multiple parties saying, oh, we have a different economic theory, which we're selling to voters. Economic theory is what guides public policy. That is, the policy decisions that a government makes to regulate an economy comes from economic theory. The economic theory can be wrong and has been repeatedly wrong. So when somebody cites an economic theory as a reason for public policy, as a journalist, you want to ask the question, what is the basis of that policy? What's the evidence that your policy is correct? So an example of public policy that comes from economic theory, Paul Krugman uses deregulation of the financial markets. Deregulation of the financial markets means that the government will regulate business and economies less because of the theory that less government regulation of the economy and the market creates more wealth for everybody. And that's typically a conservative or a Republican point of view. It's the point of view of the Mercer family, billionaire family, which was funding the Donald Trump campaign in 2016. Okay, Krugman, as an expert, says basically that deregulation of financial markets helps the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, or in other words, deregulation increases economic inequality. The 2007-2008 financial crisis was caused, according to Krugman, by the deregulation of banking that led to subprime mortgages, and subprime mortgages lowered the criteria for people to borrow money. So that was good for the lending agencies because the deregulation allowed them to lend more money and therefore collect more interest. The problem, according to economists like Krugman, is that by deregulating mortgages and lowering the criteria for people to borrow, that led to an inflated market bubble of housing, which then collapsed because people started to be in default of their mortgages because the criteria had been lowered. And when I say that, one casualty of that financial crisis in 2007 and 2008 seemed to be our journalism program, because I noticed when I looked at journalism enrollment, it dipped drastically in 2008 at this time of the economic crisis. Now, I say that's a correlation. That doesn't prove causation, but the numbers data seem to be there, to be happening together. I might speculate that journalism students had less money because of the financial crisis, and that meant that they either postponed or their education or delayed their education. So, that's an interesting correlation there. Like I said, I wouldn't claim it's causation, but that's the sort of thing phenomenon you look like and produces interesting stories. In general, like I said, conservative politicians like Republicans in the United States, Conservative Party in Canada, push for deregulation and lower taxation, particularly lower taxation for the wealthy, because they say this stimulates the economy by reducing taxation for the wealthy. Lower taxation often comes with a reduction in government programs for citizens, particularly poorer citizens. And the mystery is, like I said, why the economically disadvantaged vote for politicians who will reduce government support for citizens like them and pass measures that increase the wealth for the wealthier. And in these situations, in these theories, we're always left with the prickly problem of what is the cause and what is the effect. Do economics affect politics, or does politics affect economics? We can see both. We can see that economics can create pressure, can create the pressure that changes politics. And we can see that politicians have the power to make economic decisions for countries. So which is the cause and which is the effect? Does economics affect politics, or does politics affect economics? Krugman, as an economist, interestingly, believes that politics causes economic change. Well, we don't have to decide, but we can, as journalists, understand the issues and be cautious of what politicians and experts say. We can challenge them with questions. So in 2017, Trump passed a big tax cut bill that will raise the U.S. deficit. Krugman calls that, quote, the biggest tax scam in history, end quote. Krugman said that adding significant tax increases to 2/3 of the middle class by shifting money to the wealthy and to the corporation by reducing their taxes is not a good deal for the middle class. It is fair to say, though, as Krugman says, that reducing taxes for the rich, as Trump and Republicans and conservative politicians wants, increases economic inequality. And remember, economic inequality, theory aside, economic inequality can be demonstrated with economic data. So that leads us to economics and local government. And the text gives 6 recurring issues in reporting on local government, and some of those relating to economics, issues that you can use to raise questions and stimulate yourself to stories. For example, how does the new global economy affect the local economy? Boom and stagnation. You can apply that issue to just about every community. Or you can look at the issue of limited revenue capacity. A local government doesn't have unlimited funds from taxing homeowners, never has enough money. So the local government has to make tough choices in how to spend the tax dollars. Already, I previously talked about how huge amounts of money can be at stake in rezoning property. I'm not going to review that right now, but just remind you of how that technical issue of zoning and rezoning affects citizens, retail stores and industries. Has a big impact on them, has a big impact on lifestyle, and has huge economic effects. So I talked about the local budget and taxation in a municipal council. I already indicated that as a typical budget process is scheduled and cyclical, which means that you can anticipate the stages of the local budget process, and you can be ready for the stages. You can plan to write a story according to the dates in the schedule for the cyclical budget, the yearly budget. And so, in a typical municipal government like Kamloops, the budget process first goes through committee stages where various committees debate. It might be called a budget committee. Will start debating the issues before the issues advance to the council stage. And typically they go back and forth. But there is interesting activity at the committee stage before the issues reach council. And that's an advantage to you as a journalist, because usually those committees are open to the public. So you can cover the debate at the committee level before it gets to council and inform your readers. And since it's a process, since a municipal budget or a federal budget is an annual process, planned and scheduled, as a process, it means that things are going to be debated, negotiated, and changes. So it's like covering a horse race. What are the issues in the beginning? What gets cut from the initial budget and what gets reduced from the budget in the process? Who in the community are the winners and losers at different stages in the process? What is the public reaction to the process before final decision is made on the budget? What is the influence of the public reaction to the process on the process? How do the stories you write as a journalist of public reaction influence the process? So to look at this, to wind up the session, look at an example of this, of the drama of this process. So the city council gets the revenue to fund city operations from taxes from homeowners, retail stores, and industry. Now, the city may want to create an incentive to draw new businesses and new industries to come to the city by giving a deal, as for example, to reduce their taxes. If the businesses or industries come to the city, that will eventually increase the tax revenue and maybe provide jobs for the residents. But if the incentive is reducing the taxes of the new businesses, it's a zero-sum game. And what that means is if you give the incentive to draw new businesses and new industries into the city, that is lost revenue. And that means that the existing taxpayers have to make up for the lost revenue. Lost revenue in one part of the budget requires increased revenue in the other part of the budget. Somebody has to pay for the tax break. Or another example, suppose an industry in the city is not doing well financially. It may come to council asking for a tax break with the implication that if the council doesn't give it a tax break, it may close or relocate, which means less tax revenue and lost jobs. And some residents may pressure council to give this business or industry a tax break because they don't want to see lost jobs. Other residents may pressure council because they don't want a tax increase for themselves because the business want a tax increase because the business gets a tax increase. Let me end by saying that when you're covering economics, when you're covering the municipal budget, relate the story to the lives of residents. Don't simply give the numbers, give the impact. What is the effect of the budget on each household? What are the factors affecting the budget? In Kamloops, the budget could be affected by increased snowfall. That is, when it snows more in one winter in Kamloops, the amount budgeted for snow removal based on an average year may not be enough, so the council overspends on snow removal, and that has an impact. Or the rise in crime might have an impact. So in a municipality like Kamloops, the municipality pays the police budget, but it doesn't control the police department. The police department comes to the council and says, we'd like 10 more police officers because crime is increasing. And the city now has to say, okay, what's the cost to us? And can we afford the cost? But don't we need to protect citizens against crime by having more police officers? So even policing comes down to a budget item. And I looked at, one time I looked at the city budget to see what was the biggest percentage of the budget and what was the smallest percentage of the budget. That is, what is most expensive and what would you expect to be most expensive in the budget in a municipality like Kamloops? Well, one of the highest percentages of the budget, 22%, was going to the police, almost 1/4. About 16% was going to fire and rescue, and on down the list. That's always interesting. Anyway, this is a good point for me to end. My point is that as a journalist, you don't always want to do the math, but economics is always important in journalism. There's always an economic angle. That economic angle has direct impact on citizens, and you are valuable as a paid journalist to the citizens because you can do the math that they don't want to do.